This is the way my map looked mid-April. The North Vietnamese just rolled down the coast. Saigon was clearly threatened. The situation was urgent. Urgent understates it.
At this time, Ambassador Martin had been back in Washington, trying to persuade Congress to vote additional aid.
He has no statement today.
He came back to Saigon, and my boss, the CIA station chief, said, "Go down and tell the old man what's happening." I went in and I said, "Mr. Ambassador, half of the South Vietnamese army has disintegrated. We're in grave trouble. Please, sir, plan for an evacuation. At least allow us to begin putting together lists of South Vietnamese we should rescue." And he said, "No, Frank, it's not so bleak, and I won't have this negative talk."
Communist ground forces have started moving in on Saigon's Tan Son Nhut Airport.
Rockets exploded all over the base, touching off 3 major fires.
The air base was under continuous artillery fire. I felt the rounds. They were so close. The shrapnel was clinking against the fence behind us. It was abundantly clear that it was a whole new ball game.
We never expected any trouble out there. And then, of course, fear a little bit set in because now we knew that it really meant business, you know. Were they going to continue shelling Tan Son Nhut? They're giving us a warning, you know. Get out.
As the sun came up, General Smith, who was our defense attaché out at Tan Son Nhut, contacted the ambassador and said, "The plan to use the fixed wing to get a few thousand people out today isn't going to work. And we need to consider that this is it. Option 4, a heavy lift helicopter evacuation." And Ambassador Martin wouldn't hear of it. He said, "I want to come out there. I want to see it." Which he did. He got in a sedan. He didn't lack for guts. There was still rounds coming in. Sporadic. But there was still artillery fire. And he could see that the main runway was full of craters from North Vietnamese artillery. And it was understood that General Smith was not being premature with the recommendation for option 4.
Ambassador Martin's concern very clearly, up to now, was that once we start an official evacuation, it's pretty obvious that the game is over. You got to remember, this is an ambassador who had lost his only son in combat in Vietnam. One becomes pretty invested in that country. He had been holding out hope that some kind of third-party solution could be worked out so that South Vietnam could continue with some form of independence or autonomy. And he was being encouraged to think that this might be possible. But the morning of the 29th, he came to accept the fact that that wasn't going to happen.
And I picked up the phone and told Secretary Kissinger to inform the President that I had decided that we would have to go to option 4.
When I tell President Ford the airport is being shelled and I say it's now time to pull the plug, he keeps coming back time and again. You really think we have to do it? That's how heartbreaking it was for him. He finally, reluctantly, gave the go-ahead for the final evacuation.
Why did you join the Navy? How old were you?
I was 18 years old. It was September 26, 1971, And the reasons I joined the Navy are various. I think a big influence was President John F. Kennedy, who I basically idolized as a little boy, and all of his exploits in the South Pacific on PT-109 were in the news quite a bit before his election and even after his election. Also, as a boy, there was a documentary series called Victory at Sea that we watched pretty regularly as a family when I lived in Stockton, California, before we moved to Santa Cruz. Probably the third and maybe the largest reason is that I spent most of my boyhood in Santa Cruz, California, which is a California coastal town, and I spent a lot of time in the water surfing, and I always wanted to be close to the water when I got older, and I thought I might be guaranteed being close to the water in the U.S. Navy as opposed to the other services. And turns out I was right.
What was your first duty station and what were your duties? Any highlights?
My first duty station after Radioman A School in San Diego, California was NAVCOM Stay Harold E. Holt, which is, or was, a communication station on the Northwest Cape of Western Australia. It was about 800 miles north of Perth, Western Australia, in the middle of nowhere. There were emus, there were cockatoos, and lots of kangaroos. I worked in the message center. Before I went to the message center, I had to pay my dues, basically doing janitorial work in the quarters. They're like barracks for enlisted men. So I had to scrub floors, polish floors, and do a lot of the janitorial stuff before I actually went to my work center, which was the message center at NAVCOM Stay Harold E. Holt. There I worked in the fleet center and tape relay to ships in the Indian Ocean and in the Western Pacific during the Vietnam War. The primary purpose of NAVCOM Stay Harold E. Holt was to provide very low frequency messages to submarines operating in the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. Its secondary mission was to communicate with surface ships in those two areas.
You were on the USS Thomaston during the evacuation of Saigon. What were your duties there?
I was a radioman second class, and I stood my watches in Radio Central, known affectionately as the Radio Shack. And during the evacuation, we were incredibly busy because communications are the lifeblood of the fleet, and we were sending a lot of what's called flash traffic, which you have just 10 minutes to get the message out, therefore it's a flash. We had a lot of flash messages to transmit to the task group commander, to CTF 76. A lot of traffic was going all the way immediately to Washington, D.C., where it was going to the operations center. And so it was a very frenetic, busy time for all of the radiomen. I was very busy either sending messages, tuning transmitters, tuning receivers, typing messages, and doing the clerical work and the crypto work that's involved with being a radioman on a ship. But at this time, the volume was extremely high. We took on about 1,000 refugees on the Thomaston itself. Between watches, I actually saw some of the helicopters pushed over the side of the helicopter ships. I actually witnessed that in person as it was happening. We've seen most of those on the newsreels.
Aside from the evacuation of Saigon, do you have any other indelible memories of your time on the Thomaston?
Too many to mention here, but a few stand out. One was ironing on my E5 Crow, it's called, on my uniform in the Watch Center when I made E5, which happened when I was in the Philippines that year. I think that was around January 1975.
What is E5?
So that the E5 was a promotion. So it's usually as far as you can get on your first 4-year hitch, and I had hit a major goal, so it was just a real nice moment. thinking back on it. I really haven't thought about it in years. The other one is not a sweet memory, but it's definitely indelible, and that was the Thanksgiving of 1974. It's the same cruise that ended up with the evacuation of Saigon. The Thanksgiving of 74, we were in very heavy seas. At one point, a lot of us had to tie ourselves into our racks. A rack is a bunk. It's what you sleep in at sea in your compartment. But the storms were so heavy that we were tying ourselves into our racks so we could sleep, if that makes any sense whatsoever. And so during that period, I came off of watch to go down and eat on the mess decks, what you call a cafeteria, and there was fluid running back and forth on the mess decks. It was about an inch deep, and what it was Kool-Aid that had come off of spilled drinks that were on the tables during these heavy seas. That wasn't so bad. What was bad, that among the turkey and the dressing and all of the other fixings of Thanksgiving floating around and across my boots during this Thanksgiving meal was throw up and chunks from other sailors who had gotten sick on the mess decks during the heavy seas. So it's just part of life at sea that I don't miss, but an indelible memory from Thanksgiving 1974.
Why did you become an officer, and what was officer candidate school like?
When I finished my education at UC Santa Cruz, the last couple of years I really thought I would go to law school. But then I started missing the Navy, believe it or not. And I remember some officers who had made real impressions on me, who I admired very much, and I'm sure that had an influence on my ultimate decision. And I have to admit, I missed the Navy. So I interviewed for Officer Candidate School, known as OCS, which is one of the routes you can take to get your commission. You have to have a college education to become an officer, and there's 3 basic routes that you can take to become an officer. One of them is OCS, which is a concentrated program after college. It's usually about 16 weeks and has a crash course in officer knowledge, such as seamanship, navigation, engineering, all the basic areas of expertise for naval officers. You get a real grounding in them. It's certainly not complete. And to have a further grounding, you go to Division Officer School either in Newport, Rhode Island or in San Diego, California, which I did after OCS. The 2 other routes to a commission are the Naval Academy and ROTC, which a lot of colleges in the country have.
What was your first duty station as an officer, and what were your duties?
My first duty station after I was commissioned was aboard the USS Fox, a cruiser that was stationed in San Diego, California. I worked in the operations department as the Combat Information Center Officer, or the CICO. My division was about 40, ranging from very junior personnel, E3s, to very senior enlisted master chiefs. My duties in the combat center were anti-air warfare, anti-surface warfare, anti-submarine warfare, and training of personnel, rating personnel, providing basic leadership for people in the department to achieve the ship's mission. My other main duty on the Fox was, first I had to get qualified as an officer of the deck, and I stood officer of the deck watches on the bridge. So that was a daily duty which I stood, either in the morning, the afternoon, the evening, or the mid-watch, having full responsibility for the ship when the captain wasn't on the bridge of the ship.
Any close calls when you were serving as the officer of the deck?
The one that comes to mind most immediately is actually when I was on USS Valdez, which was one of my last duty stations. The Valdez was out of Newport, Rhode Island, where we were doing operations off of the East Coast, and we were returning to port in Newport. We were returning over the 100 fathom curve, which is a very busy fishing area that is east of Newport, and there were lots of fishing vessels. One of the fishing vessels was coming straight at us off of my starboard bow. It had constant bearing and decreasing range, which means you're on a collision course in navalese. So I looked through my binoculars, and the skipper of the boat was not at the wheel, was not at the helm of this large fishing boat, and it was going pretty fast. And the skipper of the boat was leaning over the stern or the back of the boat, taking in his nets. So no one was in control of the boat, which was on a collision course with my ship. It was a couple of 100 yards out, maybe 300 yards out off the starboard bow. And so I sounded the emergency signal, which is 5 short blasts. When he heard the 5 short blasts, he turned around and he ran to his wheel, and we could see him leaning on it to the left as his boat came left and narrowly missed the starboard rear quarter of our ship. So that was a close call. And after the 5 short blasts, of course, my captain came running up to the bridge and said, "What the is going on?" in a very loud voice.
You were in the reserves after you finished active duty. What were your duties there?
My specialty changed a little bit in the reserves. Before I was in the reserves, I was a surface warfare officer in the Navy. There's 3 main operational jobs in the Navy, which are air, surface, or submarines. If you're not in those 3 main operational areas, you're in the support forces, like doctors and lawyers and health professionals and engineers and Seabees. When I got into the reserves, I was put into something called Naval Control of Shipping. And we trained to control, track, and protect merchant vessels during time of war. And that became my specialty in the Naval Reserve for most of my years in the Navy Reserve. 1 year I trained Navy midshipmen out of Annapolis, and that was a little departure from my main job in NCS, or Naval Control of Shipping.
Were there any highlights during your reserve years?
There were many, but for the sake of brevity, I'll talk about the summer I was training midshipmen down at Annapolis. I was on the bridge of a yard patrol craft. These are small boats that train midshipmen and seamen and seamanship and navigation. And there was a team on the bridge, a conning officer, an officer of the deck, someone at the engine order telegraph, etc. So they were basically mirroring the organization you have on a regular Navy surface ship. We were coming south in a formation 1, which is 1 ship behind the other, or in this case, 1 boat behind the other. Your spacing is very short compared to ships at sea, but it's very short. I think we're about 150 yards behind each other. And as we were coming to the mouth of Delaware Bay, a large merchant ship swung wide, coming northbound and right into our line, basically. The lead boat in our line ahead swung to the right and narrowly missed the merchant ship. My officer of the deck, my student officer of the deck, froze, so I immediately said, "Hard right rudder, all ahead full." We came right smartly, and then we shifted our rudder so we would avoid shoal water, and I may have saved some lives.